point. And you might say, well, are we going to get into the 20th century? Well, we are some, but the thing is, Descartes raises issues that philosophers were grappling with well into the 20th century. And the issue raised here surrounds whether, if the mind is acquainted only with its own inner experiences, if what we first experience is only only the contents of our own minds, how do we know for sure that those contents are what they seem to be? In other words, the experiences that we seem to be having, we relate to being caused by objects in a real room on a third floor, second floor of a real building. We think there are real people in that room. But Descartes, in raising this conjecture about dreaming that we looked at last time, basically raises the issue that if what the mind is acquainted with is only its own experiences, how do we know that those experiences aren't simply created by the mind itself, aren't simply dream images that the mind is creating for us? We saw in that clip from The Matrix that what those people were experiencing in the pods were experiences that a computer program was supposedly creating for them. And Descartes says this is a problem if we don't have any tests by which we can for sure distinguish between a waking state and a sleeping state. We saw that he rejects obvious tests like feeling your hand and saying it's a real hand, or shaking your head, noticing your eyes are open. He says you can do all this in a dream. So for him, there aren't any sure signs that we're awake. Now, I guarantee you there will be an essay option on test 2 where we're going to ask you to weigh in on this if you want, as to whether you agree with Descartes that there aren't any sure signs to tell whether or not you're asleep or awake. But he says, if this is true, and if my mind is acquainted only with its own contents, and those contents might be just fictitious dream images created by the mind itself, then maybe what they seem to tell me is wrong. They seem to tell me I have real hands and a real body, but what if that's not the case? And, I think I said last time, the 20th century philosophers talked about it this way. They said, well, for Descartes, for all we know, we could all be brains in a vat, right? We're nothing but brains, no body at all. But the brain is creating all of these experiences for us, and we're in a vat hooked up to tubes that keep the brain alive. So maybe, he says, I don't have hands and a body at all. Maybe these are just fictitious dream images. Now, again, it's not that Descartes doubts this in his real life, but he's raising philosophical issues. He says, you can have real parts that are from imaginary animals. I'm not going to stay on this one too long. But this is kind of the bottom line of what this first conjecture, this dream conjecture, implies. it implies not only that we can consider as doubtful the information that our senses give us about what's going on in the room around us today, but it also casts doubt on the information we receive in the observational sciences. It says these sciences, for all we know, may be dealing with fictitious objects. And physics, astronomy, chemistry were around in rudimentary forms even in Descartes' day. And so this casts doubt on observational sciences that rely either on observations of the senses directly or observations with the senses aided by tools like telescopes and microscopes. So now he's called into doubt the information that we receive from the physical sciences. But he says this conjecture that we might be dealing with imaginary dream objects, his dream conjecture, doesn't seem to cast doubt on all sciences. More abstract sciences like mathematics seem to remain intact and can't be thrown into doubt. In other words, he says, even if the square we're talking about is an imaginary dream square, it's still got to have four sides. He says in a dream, he's convinced that 2 + 3 basic arithmetic is going to hold, and 2 + 3 is still going to equal 5. I always had problems with him on this because the way things seem to come into and go out of existence in dreams, you want to say, how do you know that in a dream 2 + 2 + 3 equals 5? So he says, seems like these sciences remain certain and beyond doubt. That's what indubitable means, even if they were about fictitious dream objects. They're still about real qualities, colors, extensional location in space, quantity, size, and number. These are the things that abstract sciences deal with. And he says these properties are real even if they are the properties of imaginary entities. So he says, here's the second principle that defines a whole category of beliefs. Beliefs we have and knowledge we claim to have from abstract sciences like mathematics. Descartes says, could anything possibly cast doubt on such seemingly perfect knowledge? Could anything ever make me think I go wrong in adding 2 + 3 or counting the sides of a square? You say, how can I go wrong in counting? Well, sometimes I even go wrong in passing out 4 versus 5 test papers for a row. In backgammon, we often compare our position versus our opponent's position by taking what we call a pip count, a count of how many numbers on the dice it would take for us to get into our home board and get all our playing pieces off versus what it would take for our opponent. Because it's a racing game, and you can see whether you're ahead in the race if it's going to take you fewer rolls of the dice to get off than your opponent. But sometimes when you're trying to count pieces on the backgammon board, sometimes you add wrong or you don't keep track right, and you can mess up in your count. And you say, well, this is what I had, and your opponent says, no, I had something different. And you're both counting the same thing. So we sometimes in basic counting, even though all of us can count to 100 with our eyes closed, you can go wrong. Could anything ever make me think I go wrong in things like this? Well, let me ask you this, and I'm not this is a rhetorical question. I'm not asking for a real show of hands. But I mean, how many of you have ever gotten less than 100 on a math test? Now, if that happened, probably you made a mistake along the way in one or more problems. You were doing a proof in algebra or in, geometry, and you messed up along the way. Now, I remember when I was in school, the kinds of mistakes you liked to make were the ones where you made two different mistakes in the same problem, but they canceled one another out, and so he still came out with the right answer. And if your teacher wasn't paying too close attention, you might still get credit, even though you made two mistakes along the way. Well, in order to maybe get a handle on how Descartes cast doubt on even such certain knowledge as mathematical knowledge, remember that you've often by yourself, or not often maybe, but at least at times have made mistakes while doing a math problem. Well, suppose there were some evil entity that had it in for you and that was whispering the wrong data in your ear when you were trying to do a math problem and misleading you and throwing you off track. Well, this is kind of the conjecture that Descartes, he talks about what he calls an evil genius. Some books say, well, he really means an evil demon or a demonic entity. Because he says, maybe God's not going to mislead me and mess me up in my math, right? Because it seems inconsistent with viewing God as a good creator, that he would want to systematically deceive us. Now, Descartes raises this question in the Meditations and never gives a satisfactory answer, at least as I can recall. Yet God allows us to be deceived sometimes, why not always? But he says, look, I mean, first of all, he doesn't want to get in trouble with the church, right? Plus, we're going to see Wednesday, he needs God to bail him out. So he says, if God is the source of goodness and truth, why may I not be instead constantly deceived by some malicious demon, some entity that has it in for me and that is causing me to go wrong? And now here again, remember I said one of the names for Descartes' method, besides methodological skepticism and methodic doubt, is hyperbolic doubt. Now, what do you do if you use hyperbole in English to make a point? Well, in a way, but I mean, basically, you exaggerate something to make. So this is.
Like Delilah turned into a pillar of salt.
Oh, well, okay. So, some people might call that hyperbole. But at any rate, here we're talking about an exaggerated type of doubt. But Descartes thinks that even if he can raise this almost unreal type of exaggerated doubt by postulating this evil entity, that still is enough for him to throw doubt on basic beliefs in mathematics and throw doubt on the proposition that this is good knowledge. So he says all these beliefs seem to be doubtful. A powerful enough demon could delude him in all his judgments, right? about the reality of things that he perceives, and also abstract things, the sky, the air, the earth, but also about color, shape, sounds, anything external, and about whether he even has a body at all, right? And he says, all may be doubted and will be set aside as if false. So he's going to set aside even mathematical truth. So at this point, you wonder, well, does our story have a happy ending, or does it end in despair? Does Descartes ever find what he's looking for? Because remember, Descartes is not trying to be a skeptic himself. Now, later, the empiricist David Hume wanted to be a skeptic, that he wanted to end in skepticism. Descartes is only using skeptical arguments to try to get to absolutely certain principles. And if he can find at least one certain truth, it's like finding a gold nugget, right? It's going to function like Archimedes' point. Now, I drew that diagram, and you can see how challenged I am when it comes to art. Right, where Archimedes, if you remember from your physics, was so enamored with the properties of levers and their, we talk about leverage and their ability to enable us to lift things far beyond what we could do unaided by them, that he made the bold claim that if he had a lever long enough, he could even lift the earth itself. But what do you need to rest a lever on to get it to lift something? Well, if you see you need a fixed point, a fulcrum to rest it on, right? And that's what Descartes' looking for. He's looking for one absolutely certain kernel of truth, and that's going to be like Descartes, Archimedes' point. So Archimedes claimed that movement of the entire Earth was possible from one firm, immovable point, and Descartes longs to find one certain, unshakable truth on which to rest the whole of knowledge. And that's going to be like a Euclidean axiom and like an Archimedean point. So does he find it? Well, he does. Descartes says, should I doubt my own existence, or can I even do this? Concerning whether he should doubt his own existence, he observes, well, look, even if I'm dreaming everything, even if he has authored his own thoughts, even if his mind has created a reality, still he says, I have to be here in order to create this reality, in order to author my own thoughts. So I must be something. I must exist. And he says, even if he is doubting everything else, if he's convinced himself that there's absolutely nothing in the world. This is a quote from No Sky, No Earth, No Minds, No Bodies. Again, the page reference, not to any text we're using, but it's right from his Meditations in translation. Even if he's doing all this doubting, he has to exist in order to convince himself of this. In other words, if he's doubting everything, the one thing he can't doubt is that he has to exist to do the doubting. Or take being deceived. If a demon is constantly deceiving him about all his other beliefs, he says, the one thing he can't deceive me about is that I have to exist. In other words, if I'm being deceived about everything by this demon, I have to be here to be deceived. So he says, that's my Archimedean point. I cannot doubt, says Descartes, my own existence. And this becomes his Archimedean point, the one fixed, absolutely true truth that he thinks he can rest everything on. Now, the way he says it in the Meditations is the way I have it up there as a title. He says the statement or the proposition I am or I exist is, he says, necessarily true anytime I think it or pronounce it, says Descartes. He finds his Archimedean point, the indubitable axiom. That is, indubitable means what? Beyond doubt, right? The indubitable axiom on which to base his philosophy. Now, the way you and I learned this, even before we ever came into a philosophy class, is the way he says this elsewhere. I believe it's in his Discourse on Method. He expresses it in the Latin phrase, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. So this becomes Descartes' Archimedean point, the one solid axiom. Now, one of the things that Descartes did is when he does more thinking on what he is, what does this I refer to in I think, therefore I am? Descartes broke new ground in psychology as well as philosophy in doing this. He talks about his own human nature, and he's not very satisfied with the definition we saw from the Greeks, right? We looked at Aristotle's ethics and the fact that Aristotle, in line with Plato, saw us as essentially rational or reasoning beings. That's our essence. But he says, I'm not going to really spend much time on the classical definition of human beings or man as a rational animal. He says, first of all, it's unclear to me exactly what rational and animal are supposed to mean there. And he says this road may lead to harder questions. It might raise more questions than it answers, in other words. So he says, I'm not going to go down that road. And he says, I've thought about the body. Believed I had a body, says Descartes. Believed the body performed various functions, and also that his soul performed various functions like perceiving things, thinking, right, rational thought, initiated movements. But he says, I haven't given much thought to the nature of the mind. And this is where Descartes breaks new ground here. He says, except to maybe look at classical conceptions of the mind as like a wind, the pre-Socratic philosopher Anaximenes thought that the soul was air, it was like a wind. Others thought it was like fire or ether. Now, it's interesting that even into the 20th century, there was a debate about whether the luminous ether existed. Now, I could never go back to the early days of philosophy in ancient Greece, but what was kind of interesting is I became a ham radio operator when I was, in my early years at Poly, right? I was like 14 years old. And back then, in the 1960s, the people who were in their late 70s and 80s had been around at the turn of the century in the earliest days of radio. They were sending spark signals across the Atlantic. And sometimes I would get to talk to some of these people at a Saturday morning coffee. And in the early 20th century, the debate was still going on as to whether the luminous ether existed. In other words, the thought is that if radio waves are waves, what is the medium through which those waves travel? In other words, if I throw a rock into a still pond, and now I get waves going out in every direction from where the rock entered the water, if that were a dried up pond, I wouldn't get any waves, right? You need a medium. In this case, you need water in which to produce the waves. So the thought was they postulated this entity that was beyond the reach of our senses, the luminous ether. Now,
Like air, luminous ether?
well, sort of like it, except it wasn't air. It was some other existing thing that they postulated. Now, pardon?
Like a six.
But it would be like air, you know. And so it was a theoretical entity. Now, I don't understand all the details, but I understand that Einstein's theories of relativity disproved for once and for all the existence of a luminous ether, but it was still a matter of debate. So Descartes tries to push the definition of what we are as a human being beyond what he has seen before. He says, well, look, the body has various characteristics, right? Now here, you got to understand that in modern philosophy, in the modern period, when we're talking about the rationalists and the empiricists, the word body is used with more than one meaning. We saw before Descartes was specializing. I mean, could somebody turn off that phone or stop using it?
Oh, no, I think it's not, I'm recording. It's not.
Okay. Well, all right. Just leave it alone. I'm also integrity recording this, by the way. But at any rate, I mean, you can leave your recording go. Body is also used as a synonym for matter, for material substance, for this stuff, the stuff this room is made out of, right? And he says matter, body, has various properties, right? It has shape. It's located in space, right? This thing is here and not over there. It occupies space to the exclusion of other bodies, these basic Newtonian principles. It's perceivable by the senses, capable of motion in space. And he says the mind, or immaterial soul, must also have properties. He says the deceiver has made the properties of body, has brought them in doubt. All the properties I perceive my body to have, at this point for Descartes, may be fictitious. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but right now the properties of the body are called into doubt. But Descartes says, what am I essentially? He says, I'm not essentially a body, but I'm essentially an immaterial thinking soul. He says, the chief characteristic of the mind or soul, and he does not make a sharp distinction between the two, is thought, right? I think, therefore I am, says Descartes. So he says, thought is what is inseparable from my human nature. If I should cease to think, then I should cease to exist. So he says, strictly speaking, he is a thing that thinks. Or Descartes says he's a thinking thing. right? That's what we essentially are as human beings for him. So here's where Descartes breaks some new ground, is in the attributes he thinks pertain to a mind or soul. He says he portrays the mind, and this is what the 20th century philosopher Gilbert Ryle, who criticized Descartes for this view, said that for Descartes, the mind is like a quasi-machine, an immaterial machine in which immaterial processes take place, just as the body is like a machine where material processes like circulation of blood, elimination of waste, the kind of things you were taught in biology class take place, right? So he says, what I mean by thinking is that the mind has certain mental processes going on, like doubting, understanding, affirming, denying something, imagining or perceiving something. These all, he laid the groundwork for what was called faculty psychology, which is a precursor to psychology as a science later on. Now, he knows for most of us, even if we believe, say, that we have an immaterial soul, even if that's, say, a matter of faith, most of us would claim to be more sure of the existence of our body than of ourselves as an immaterial substance or soul, right? The body is known by the senses. We get mental image of the body's attributes, whereas we have no mental image of the immaterial soul. This, by the way, is an observation that the philosopher David Hume later uses as a skeptical reason to question the existence of the soul. But he says, wouldn't it be odd if we had a more distinct grasp of what now is doubtfully existing material substance than of the truly existing self? So he tries to say we have, by our reason, a better knowledge of ourselves as an immaterial thinking thing than even as a material being. So he's trying to stand on its head our normal conception about what we think is reliable knowledge. So he says the nature of bodies is not known by the senses, but by reason. Hence we call Descartes a rationalist. He thinks our reasoning abilities can give us insights in a reality that are even better than anything our senses could do. He says, take a heated piece of wax. After you heat it, all of the properties of the wax that our senses can perceive have changed. And yet, we want to say the heated wax is the same wax as the piece of wax we had before we heated it. He says, what enables us to say this? It can't be our senses, says Descartes, because all of the properties of the wax that our senses can perceive have changed after we heated it. What tells us it's the same wax? Descartes says it's reason, not the senses, that tell us that the heated wax is the same piece of wax. So the true nature of the wax, he says, is perceived by the mind alone, not by the senses. So he's trying to convince us that our reason gives us more of a knowledge of material objects than our senses. So he says, the self is known better by the mind. Awareness of the self is more certain than the existence of any material objects. He says, any observation that confirms the existence of something material like a piece of wax also confirms our existence. If we say the wax exists because I see it, I have to be around to see the wax. If we say it exists because I touch it, I have to be around as a being that has, capability of feelings of touch, or because I imagine it, in other words, can form a mental image of it. I have to be around to form that mental image. So Descartes says we're more certain that we're an immaterial substance than we are even that we have a material body. Now, obviously, this is the reverse of what most of us would say, and he understands this. So he says if material things are known not by the senses, but in being understood by the intellect alone, a material thing like, say, the piece of wax, he says the mind is even better known this way. So he takes his own existence as primary to developing a firm basis of philosophy. Now, I'm going to sketch out next time where he goes from there, and we're going to look at empiricism. Now, I haven't called the roll yet, so I'm going to do that.